Mom discovers her 14-year-old son is a killer, sentenced to life for triple murder. The 14-year-old boy laughed in court as they read out the names of his victims. 3 bodies, 1 night, and he sat there grinning like it was all a game. His mother screamed from the gallery, begging him to show remorse, to say something, anything. But Mason Carter just shrugged. He actually shrugged. The prosecutor held up the murder weapon, a blood-soaked baseball bat, and this child looked bored. He thought being 14 meant he was untouchable. He thought the system would go easy on him because of his age. He was wrong, because what happened next in that courtroom would prove that some crimes are so monstrous, age doesn't matter. And the person who destroyed him wasn't the judge. It was his own mother. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. 6 months before that courtroom scene, Mason Carter was just another kid in suburban Ohio. He played video games. He went to school. He had friends, or at least people thought he did. His mother, Linda Carter, worked 2 jobs to keep their small house running. She trusted her son. She believed in him. She had no idea that behind his bedroom door something dark was growing, something that would destroy 3 innocent lives and shatter her own forever. The night of March 15th started like any other. The Henderson family, David, Sarah, and their 12-year-old daughter Emma, were settling in for dinner. They had no enemies, no reason to fear. They didn't know that a teenager with a baseball bat was already walking toward their front door. Mason Carter was 14 years old when he committed murder, but if you had seen him in the weeks before that night, you would have never suspected a thing. He was quiet in school. He kept to himself mostly. Teachers described him as unremarkable, the kind of student who blended into the background. His grades were average. He never caused trouble. He was invisible in the best possible way. But invisibility can be a mask. And behind Mason's blank stare and soft-spoken demeanor, something had been festering for years, something his mother never saw coming. Linda Carter was a single mom doing her best. She worked morning shifts at a local diner and evening shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. Money was tight, but she made it work. She came home exhausted every night, but she always checked on Mason. She always asked about his day, and he always said the same thing. "Fine, Mom, everything's fine." She believed him because she had to, because believing anything else meant admitting she had failed. And Linda Carter refused to be a failure. So she kept working, kept trusting, kept telling herself that her son was just a normal teenage boy going through normal teenage phases. But Mason wasn't normal, not even close. While his mother worked herself to exhaustion, Mason spent hours alone in his room. He wasn't doing homework. He wasn't playing games. He was researching, reading, planning. His browser history would later reveal thousands of searches about violent crimes, weapons, and how to avoid getting caught. He watched videos about forensics. He studied case files of killers who had made mistakes. He was educating himself, preparing for something he had already decided to do. And the scariest part? He was patient. He waited. He watched. He chose his moment with terrifying precision. The Henderson family lived 3 blocks away from the Carters. David Henderson was 42, a high school math teacher beloved by his students. His wife Sarah was 39, a nurse who worked night shifts at the county hospital. Their daughter Emma was 12, bright-eyed and full of dreams about becoming a veterinarian. They were the kind of family everyone admired. They hosted block parties. They donated to local charities. They smiled and waved at neighbors every single day. They represented everything good about small-town America. And that's exactly why Mason chose them. Mason had no personal grudge against the Hendersons. He had never spoken to Emma. He had never been inside their home. David Henderson had never taught him, and Sarah Henderson had never treated him at the hospital. They were strangers to him in every meaningful way. But that didn't matter, because Mason wasn't looking for a reason. He was looking for an opportunity. And the Hendersons, with their predictable routines and their trusting natures, were perfect. They left their back door unlocked most evenings. They kept their garage light on as a welcome beacon. They never suspected that anyone in their quiet neighborhood could wish them harm. On the afternoon of March 15th, Mason came home from school like always. His mother was already gone for her evening shift. The house was empty. He went to his room and pulled out a duffel bag from under his bed. Inside was a baseball bat he had stolen from the school gym 2 weeks earlier. He had wrapped the handle in duct tape to improve his grip. He had thought of everything. He changed into dark clothes, black jeans, and a navy hoodie. He pulled on gloves. Not winter gloves, but the kind you'd wear to avoid leaving fingerprints. He had ordered them online using a prepaid card he had bought with cash. At 14 years old, Mason Carter was already thinking like a criminal, and that should have terrified everyone. He left his house at 7:15 in the evening. Security footage from a neighbor's camera would later show him walking casually down the street, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't running. He wasn't looking around nervously. He walked like someone heading to baseball practice, like someone with nothing to hide. But inside that bag was a weapon, and inside his mind was a plan that would end 3 lives before the night was over. Mason reached the Henderson house at 7:23. The back door was unlocked, just as he knew it would be. He stepped inside, closed the door quietly behind him, and pulled out the bat. The house smelled like dinner, pasta and garlic bread. The television was on in the living room. He could hear laughter, the kind of warm family sounds that most people take for granted. Mason stood in the kitchen for a moment, bat in hand, listening, and then he walked toward that laughter, toward that warmth, toward that family who had no idea their final moments had just begun. What happened next would haunt investigators for months. It would destroy a community's sense of safety, and it would prove that evil doesn't have an age requirement. Sometimes it just wears braces and a hoodie. David Henderson woke up every morning at 5:30, even on weekends. He was the kind of man who believed in routine, in discipline, in showing up. His students loved him because he made math feel less like torture and more like a puzzle worth solving. He stayed after school to help kids who were struggling. He coached the mathletes team. He wore the same terrible dad jokes on repeat until his daughter groaned and his wife laughed, despite herself. David Henderson was good. Not perfect, but genuinely good in a way that's rare and precious. Sarah Henderson met David in college. She was pre-med, he was studying education, and they bonded over late-night study sessions and terrible cafeteria coffee. She became a nurse because she wanted to help people, and she meant it. Her co-workers described her as the person who always volunteered for the hardest shifts, who remembered everyone's birthday, who could calm down the most panicked patient with just her voice. She worked nights at the hospital, which meant she slept during the day and lived on coffee and determination. But she never complained. She kissed her daughter goodbye every evening before her shift and kissed her husband hello every morning when she returned. Their life was built on small, beautiful routines. Emma Henderson was 12 years old and obsessed with animals. Her room was covered in posters of endangered species. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday, cleaning cages and walking dogs that nobody else wanted. She had a collection of stuffed animals that she refused to get rid of, even though her parents gently suggested she was getting too old for them. She dreamed of going to veterinary school, of opening her own practice someday, of saving every animal she could. She was kind in the way that only children can be before the world teaches them to be cynical. She believed in second chances. She believed people were mostly good. The Hendersons weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They lived in a modest 2-story house with a front porch that David had repainted himself last summer. Sarah grew tomatoes in the backyard. Emma had a treehouse that was really just a wooden platform, but she loved it. Anyway, they ate dinner together every night that Sarah wasn't working. They played board games on Sunday afternoons. They were the family that neighbors pointed to and said, "That's what it should look like. That's what matters." They represented something pure in a world that often feels anything but. March 15th was a Thursday. David had stayed late at school for a parent-teacher conference. Emma had come home on the bus and immediately started her homework at the kitchen table because she wanted to finish before dinner. Sarah had the night off, a rare gift, and she was making Emma's favorite meal: spaghetti carbonara with garlic bread and a Caesar salad. The house smelled like home, like safety, like 1,000 other Thursday nights that had come before. They had no reason to think this one would be different, no reason to lock the back door or look over their shoulders or suspect that someone was coming. David arrived home at 6:45. He hugged his wife, kissed his daughter's forehead, and loosened his tie with a sigh of relief. Emma told him about a test she had aced. Sarah told him about a patient who had recovered against all odds. They talked about normal things, boring things, the beautiful mundane details that make up a life. They set the table together. They poured drinks. They sat down at 7 o'clock, the three of them, and started eating. Emma was talking about the animal shelter, about a dog named Rufus who had finally been adopted. She was smiling. They were all smiling. 23 minutes later, Mason Carter walked through their unlocked back door. He moved through the kitchen silently, the baseball bat gripped in both hands. He could hear them in the dining room. He could hear Emma's voice, bright and happy, talking about that dog. He could hear Sarah laughing at something David said. He stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of a family being a family. And then he stepped into the doorway. David saw him first. He stood up quickly, confusion crossing his face. He started to say something, probably something kind like, "Can I help you, son?" But he never finished the sentence. Mason swung the bat with everything he had. The first blow caught David across the temple. He went down hard, crashing into the table. Plates shattered. Food scattered across the floor. Sarah screamed. Emma screamed. And Mason kept swinging. He moved with purpose, with planning, with a calmness that would later horrify everyone who heard about it. This wasn't a moment of rage or passion. This wasn't an accident or a fight gone wrong. This was execution, methodical, deliberate, brutal. And when it was over, when the screaming finally stopped, Mason Carter stood in that dining room surrounded by destruction and felt nothing at all. The 911 call came in at 7:52 that evening. A neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, reported hearing screams coming from the Henderson house. She said it sounded like someone was in trouble, like something terrible was happening. The dispatcher sent 2 patrol officers immediately. They arrived at 8:03, 11 minutes that felt like hours. The front door was locked. They knocked, announced themselves, got no response. One officer went around back and found the door standing wide open. He called for his partner. They drew their weapons and went inside. The kitchen looked normal at first glance. Clean counters, a pot of pasta still warm on the stove, garlic bread wrapped in foil on the cutting board. But there was something wrong with the air, something heavy and metallic that both officers recognized instantly. Blood has a smell. Once you know it, you never forget it. They moved through the kitchen slowly, following that smell toward the dining room. And then they saw it. One officer would later say it was the worst scene he had encountered in 15 years on the force. The other officer stepped outside and threw up in the bushes. The dining room had become a slaughter site. David Henderson lay near the overturned table, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. The coroner would later count 17 separate impact wounds. 17 times Mason had swung that bat. Sarah Henderson was crumpled against the far wall, her nurse's scrubs soaked through with red. She had tried to run, tried to reach the phone on the side table. She almost made it. Emma was found near her father, one small hand still reaching toward him. She had been trying to help. Even in those final moments, She had been trying to save her dad. Blood covered everything, the walls, the floor, the ceiling where cast-off spatter had landed in terrible patterns. The table was destroyed, broken in half from the violence. Chairs were scattered, plates and glasses had shattered into thousands of pieces. And in the middle of it all, lying on the hardwood floor like some kind of sick trophy, was the baseball bat. It was covered in blood and hair and other things the officers tried not to look at too closely. The crime scene photographer would take over 300 pictures that night, each one more devastating than the last. Detective Sarah Mills arrived at 8:30. She was the lead homicide investigator for the county, 22 years of experience, and she had seen things that would break most people. But this shook her. 3 bodies, a family destroyed. And the violence of it, the sheer brutality, suggested someone filled with rage, someone personal, someone who knew them. She called for the full forensics team. She called the medical examiner. She called for additional officers to canvass the neighborhood. And then she stood in that dining room and tried to understand what kind of person could do this. The forensics team arrived and began their careful work. They photographed every angle. They collected blood samples. They dusted for fingerprints. They found shoe impressions in the blood. Size 7, small for an adult. They found fibers from a dark hoodie caught on a broken chair. They bagged the baseball bat as evidence, noting that the handle had been wrapped in duct tape. That detail stuck with Detective Mills. Someone had prepared this weapon. Someone had thought ahead. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned, calculated, and executed with disturbing efficiency. The medical examiner arrived at 9:15. Dr. Robert Chen had been doing this job for 30 years. He examined each body carefully, making preliminary notes. David had died from massive head trauma. Sarah had sustained defensive wounds on her arms and hands, which meant she had tried to fight back. Emma's injuries were concentrated on her head and upper body. Dr. Chen's hands shook slightly as he examined the child. He had a granddaughter about the same age. He had to step outside for a moment, gather himself, then return to finish his work. Time of death was estimated between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Cause of death for all 3 was blunt force trauma. Multiple impacts. They had suffered. Detective Mills walked through the rest of the house while forensics continued in the dining room. Everything else looked untouched. No forced entry at the front door, no signs of robbery, nothing taken from the bedrooms. Emma's laptop sat on her desk. Sarah's jewelry box was full. David's wallet was still in his jacket pocket in the hallway. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about theft. Someone had come into this house with one purpose only: to kill, and they had accomplished that goal with terrifying effectiveness. Mills stood in Emma's room, looking at the posters of animals, the stuffed creatures lined up on the bed, and felt rage building in her chest. A child. Someone had murdered a child in her own home. By midnight, the entire neighborhood was awake. Police cars lined the street with lights flashing. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the Henderson house. Neighbors stood in clusters on their lawns, wrapped in coats and confusion, trying to understand what had happened. Mrs. Patterson was giving her statement to an officer, tears streaming down her face. She kept saying she should have called sooner, should have checked on them herself, should have done something. The officer told her she did the right thing, but that didn't make the guilt go away. Nobody sleeps easy when murder happens 3 houses down from where your children sleep. Detective Mills called an emergency briefing at 6 the next morning. Her team assembled in the conference room, exhausted and running on coffee and adrenaline. The whiteboard filled quickly with details. 3 victims, no forced entry, no theft. Extreme violence. The crime scene suggested someone comfortable with brutality, someone who didn't panic, someone who walked in and walked out without leaving obvious traces, except they had left traces. They always do. Mills divided her team into units, canvassed the neighborhood, Pull security footage from every house within a 4-block radius. Interview friends, family, co-workers. Find out if the Hendersons had any enemies, any disputes, any reason someone would want them gone. The forensics report came back that afternoon. The baseball bat was their gold mine. Blood from all 3 victims confirmed it as the murder weapon. But more importantly, despite the duct tape on the handle, they found something. A partial thumbprint on the barrel of the bat, preserved in blood. Just one print, but it was clear enough to run through the system. They also found DNA under Sarah Henderson's fingernails. She had fought back, scratched her attacker, left evidence behind even as she died. The fibers from the hoodie were generic, available at any department store. The shoe prints were from a common brand of sneakers. But the DNA and the fingerprint, those were unique. Those would lead them to a killer. Detective Mills personally interviewed the neighbors. Mrs. Patterson repeated her story about the screams. A man 2 houses down said he saw someone walking down the street around 7:15, carrying what looked like a sports bag. Described him as young, maybe a teenager, wearing dark clothes. Didn't think anything of it at the time. Kids walked through the neighborhood all the time, heading to practices or friends' houses. Another neighbor mentioned seeing the same figure walking back the other direction about 40 minutes later, moving faster, head down. Mills felt her pulse quicken. They had a timeline. They had a direction. They had a witness. The security footage came next. 18 houses in the area had doorbell cameras or security systems. Most showed nothing useful, but one camera, mounted on a garage 3 houses down from the Hendersons, captured gold. At 7:21, clear as day, a figure walked past. Young, thin build, dark hoodie, carrying a duffel bag. The camera angle caught a partial view of his face. Mills had the tech team enhance the image, and when they did, when they got a clear look at those features, something clicked. She knew that face. She had seen it before, somewhere in the neighborhood canvas. Mills pulled out her notes from the interviews. She flipped through pages of statements until she found it. Linda Carter, interviewed that morning. Single mother, worked 2 jobs, lived 3 blocks away with her son. Mason Carter, age 14. Mills had spoken to Linda briefly, asked if she had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Linda said no, she had been at work. Her son had been home alone. Mills had moved on, focused on closer neighbors. But now she pulled up the school photo Linda had shown her during the interview. Mason Carter, 14 years old, and his face matched the figure in the security footage. Mills felt her stomach drop. A 14-year-old, a child. It didn't make sense. The violence at that scene suggested someone older, stronger, filled with rage. But the evidence didn't lie. She ran the partial fingerprint through the juvenile database. Mason Carter had been fingerprinted 2 years earlier as part of a school safety program. The print from the bat matched. 98% certainty. She ran the DNA from under Sarah's fingernails. It would take a few days for full results, but preliminary markers suggested a young male. Everything pointed to one conclusion, as impossible as it seemed. Mason Carter, 14 years old, had walked into the Henderson house and murdered 3 people. The team sat in stunned silence when Mills presented her findings. Nobody wanted to believe it. 14-year-olds played video games and worried about homework. They didn't commit triple homicides with baseball bats. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprint, the DNA, the security footage. The timeline matched perfectly. Mason's mother had been at work from 6 until 11 that night. Mason had been home alone with no alibi, no witnesses, no one to account for his time. Mills made the hardest decision of her career. She called the district attorney. She called child services. And then she went to get a warrant. At 4:30 that afternoon, Detective Mills and 3 other officers pulled up to the Carter house. Linda's car was in the driveway. She was home from her morning shift, probably resting before her evening job. Mills knocked on the door. Linda answered, confusion and concern on her tired face. Mills showed her the warrant. Linda's confusion turned to disbelief, then to denial, then to something like horror. "No," she kept saying, "not Mason. You've made a mistake. He's just a boy. He wouldn't hurt anyone." But Mills had heard those words before from other parents in other cases. Denial is always the first response when the monster turns out to be your own child. Mason was in his room playing a video game when they came for him. He looked up as Mills entered, controller still in his hands. His expression didn't change. No fear, no surprise, just a blank, empty stare that chilled Mills to her core. "Mason Carter," she said, "you're under arrest for the murders of David Serra and Emma Henderson." She read him his rights while two officers cuffed him. His mother was screaming downstairs, sobbing, begging them to stop. But Mason stayed silent. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't protest his innocence. He just stood up, let them cuff him, and walked out of his room like he had been expecting this all along. The interrogation room was cold and sterile. A metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs. A camera recording everything from the corner. Mason Carter sat with his hands folded in front of him, still wearing the clothes he had been arrested in. A graphic t-shirt from some video game. Jeans. White sneakers with a small stain on the left toe that forensics would later confirm was blood. He looked so young under those fluorescent lights. Baby-faced, skinny. The kind of kid you would see at a mall or a movie theater and never think twice about. But Detective Mills had learned long ago that evil doesn't always look the part. She sat across from him and placed a folder on the table. Mason's eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to her face. No emotion, no anxiety. Most 14-year-olds would be crying by now, calling for their parents, breaking under the pressure of being in a police station. But Mason just waited. Mills introduced herself, confirmed that Mason understood his rights, asked if he wanted a lawyer present. Mason shook his head. No lawyer. He wanted to talk. That should have been Mills' first warning sign. Guilty people who want to talk are often the most dangerous kind. They think they're smarter than everyone else. Mills started with soft questions. "Tell me about your day yesterday. What did you do after school?" Mason answered in a flat, emotionless voice. He went home, made a sandwich, played video games, did some homework. His mother left for work around 5:30. He stayed home, watched some videos online, went to bed around 10. Mills nodded, taking notes. "And you didn't leave the house at all?" she asked. Mason met her eyes. "No," he said. "I was home all night." The lie came easily. No hesitation. No tell. He believed he could sell this story. He believed he was untouchable. Mills opened the folder and pulled out a still image from the security footage. A clear shot of Mason walking down the street at 7:21, duffel bag over his shoulder. She slid it across the table. Mason looked at it for a long moment. His expression didn't change. "That's not me," he said. Mills tilted her head. "Really?" "Because we have multiple angles. We have your face. We have time stamps. We have witnesses who saw you." Mason shrugged. "Must be someone who looks like me." His arrogance was breathtaking. He actually believed he could talk his way out of this. Mills pulled out the next piece, the photograph of the baseball bat covered in blood. "We found your fingerprint on this," she said. "Your thumbprint preserved in Serra Henderson's blood. We also have your DNA under her fingernails. She scratched you when you attacked her." Mason stared at the photo. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not fear, not remorse. Annoyance, like he was frustrated with himself for making a mistake. He was silent for almost a minute. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it made Mills' blood run cold. "You can't prove anything," Mason said. His voice was different now, more confident, almost playful. Mills felt her jaw tighten. "We have your fingerprint on the murder weapon. We have your DNA on the victim. We have security footage. We have witnesses. We have a timeline that puts you at the scene during the murders." Mason's smile widened. "I want a lawyer now," he said. And just like that, the interrogation was over. He had said enough to hang himself, but not enough to confess. He had played the game exactly long enough to satisfy his ego. And now he was done. The juvenile detention center processed Mason that evening. They took his clothes, gave him standard issue items, assigned him a cell. The intake officer noted that Mason showed no signs of distress. No crying, no fear. When asked if he needed to speak to a counselor, he declined. When asked if he wanted to call his mother, he shrugged and said maybe later. The officer had processed hundreds of juveniles over the years. Gang members, drug dealers, kids who had made terrible mistakes. But something about Mason Carter unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The emptiness behind those eyes. The complete absence of anything human. Linda Carter sat in the waiting room of the police station for 6 hours before someone finally came to talk to her. Her face was swollen from crying. Her hands shook as she held a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. A victim advocate sat with her, offering comfort that couldn't possibly help. Detective Mills finally emerged and sat down beside her. Linda grabbed her arm immediately. "This is a mistake," she said. "Mason is a good boy. He gets good grades. He never gets in trouble. He wouldn't do this. Please, you have to believe me." Mills had heard this speech before. She would hear it again. Parents never want to see the truth. Mills showed Linda the evidence, the security footage, the fingerprint match, the DNA results that had just come back confirming Mason's genetic markers under Sarah Henderson's nails. She watched Linda's face as the reality crashed over her in waves. Denial gave way to confusion. Confusion gave way to horror. And horror gave way to something worse, a terrible, creeping understanding. Linda thought back over the past few months. Mason's increasing isolation, his lack of emotion, the way he spent hours alone in his room, the strange questions he sometimes asked. She had dismissed it all as teenage behavior, normal adolescent stuff, but it hadn't been normal, and some part of her had known. Some part of her had chosen not to see. Linda collapsed in that waiting room. Her sobs echoed through the halls of the police station. "My baby," she kept saying, "my baby boy." But her baby boy had stopped being innocent a long time ago. Maybe he had never been innocent at all. Mills stayed with her until Child Services arrived to help coordinate next steps. Linda would need a lawyer for Mason. She would need therapy for herself. She would need to figure out how to live with the knowledge that she had raised a killer. And as Mills walked back to her office that night, she thought about evil. How it grows. How it hides. How it can wear the face of a child and fool everyone until it's too late. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back row, cameras banned but notepads ready. The Henderson family's relatives filled the left side, dressed in black, their faces masks of grief and rage. Linda Carter sat alone on the right side, isolated even among the observers. No one wanted to sit near the mother of a monster. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. Her hair was unwashed. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. She kept her eyes down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Mason entered through a side door, flanked by 2 guards. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt that Linda had brought for him. His lawyer, a public defender named Thomas Brennan, had advised him to look as young and innocent as possible. But Mason's appearance betrayed him. He walked into that courtroom with his chin up, his shoulders back, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He scanned the gallery like he was looking for familiar faces in a school assembly. When his eyes found his mother, he didn't soften. He just stared at her for a moment, then looked away. Linda's hand went to her mouth to stifle a sob. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge Margaret Rhodes was 63 years old, with a reputation for being firm but fair. She had presided over juvenile cases for 20 years and believed deeply in rehabilitation when possible. But she also believed in justice. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the young defendant before her. Mason Carter met her gaze without flinching. Most juveniles avoided eye contact with the judge. Most showed some sign of fear or remorse. Mason showed nothing. Judge Rhodes felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen that look before, years ago, in another young offender, who later became one of the state's most prolific serial offenders. The prosecutor stood first. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh was known for her thorough preparation and her ability to communicate complex evidence to juries. But this wasn't a jury trial yet. This was just a hearing to determine if the case would proceed and whether Mason would be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. Walsh laid out the evidence methodically. The security footage showing Mason walking toward and away from the Henderson house, the fingerprint on the murder weapon, the DNA under the victim's fingernails, the timeline that matched perfectly, the premeditation evidenced by the prepared weapon and the gloves. She spoke clearly and calmly, but her voice carried the weight of 3 destroyed lives. Thomas Brennan stood to respond. He was in his 40s, tired-looking, overwhelmed by a caseload that never seemed to shrink. He argued that Mason was just 14 years old, that he had no prior criminal record, that the juvenile justice system existed for a reason, to rehabilitate young offenders, to give them a chance to reform. He talked about brain development, about how adolescents don't have fully formed impulse control. He painted Mason as a troubled child who had made a terrible mistake. But even as he spoke, even as he did his job, there was something hollow in his words. Because everyone in that courtroom knew this wasn't a mistake. This was calculated murder. Judge Rhodes listened to both sides, her expression unreadable. Then she asked a question that changed everything. She looked directly at Mason. "Mr. Carter, do you understand why you're here today?" Mason nodded. "Do you understand that 3 people are dead?" Another nod. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" The courtroom went silent. Brennan put a hand on Mason's arm, a warning to stay quiet. But Mason leaned forward slightly. He looked at the judge with those empty eyes. "They were in my way," he said. His voice was conversational, matter of fact, like he was explaining why he had taken a different route to school. The courtroom erupted. Someone screamed from the Henderson side. Multiple people started shouting. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. Guards moved closer to Mason, but the damage was done. In 5 words, Mason had revealed everything. Not remorse, not regret. Just a chilling pragmatism that confirmed what everyone had suspected. This child was not troubled. He was not confused. He was dangerous. Judge Rhodes stared at him for a long moment, her face pale. Then she made her decision. "Based on the evidence presented and the defendant's own statement, I am ruling that Mason Carter will be tried as an adult. The charges will be 3 counts of first-degree murder." Linda Carter's wail cut through the courtroom. She stood up, reaching toward her son like she could pull him back from the edge of the cliff he had thrown himself off. "Mason," she cried. "Mason, please. Tell them you didn't mean it. Tell them you're sorry." But Mason didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge her at all. The guards were already leading him out. As he reached the door, he glanced back one time. Not at his mother, not at the victims' families, at the judge. And that smirk returned to his face. A small, satisfied smile that said he had gotten exactly what he wanted. Attention, notoriety, a place in history, even if that place was as a monster. The courtroom slowly emptied. Journalists rushed out to file their stories. The Henderson family left in a protective cluster, supporting each other through their grief. Linda Carter remained in her seat, bent over, hands covering her face. A victim advocate approached her gently, tried to help her up. But Linda couldn't move. She sat there in that empty courtroom and tried to understand how the baby she had held, the toddler she had taught to walk, the boy she had loved with everything in her, had become this. How had she missed it? Where had she failed? The questions would haunt her for the rest of her life, and the worst part was knowing there were no good answers. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in September. 6 months had passed since the murders. The media attention had only intensified. News vans lined the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for position. Inside, the courtroom was arranged with military precision. The prosecution table stacked with evidence boxes. The defense table notably sparse. Mason sat beside his lawyer, wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him, making him look even younger. The jury filed in, 12 faces trying to remain neutral, though several couldn't help staring at the teenage defendant. How do you reconcile the face of a child with the horror of what he had allegedly done? District Attorney Walsh began her opening statement by projecting photos on a screen. David Henderson coaching his math team. Sarah Henderson in her nurse's scrubs, smiling at the camera. Emma Henderson at the animal shelter holding a puppy, pure joy on her face. These were real people, Walsh said. A teacher who stayed late to help struggling students. A nurse who worked double shifts to save lives. A 12-year-old girl who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. They had dinner together on March 15th. They laughed. They talked about their day. And then someone walked into their home and took everything from them. Someone took their future. Someone took their love. Someone took their lives. Walsh clicked to the next slide. The dining room crime scene. Several jurors gasped. One covered her mouth. The judge had warned them the images would be disturbing, but nothing could truly prepare someone for that level of violence. The overturned table. The blood-soaked floor. The shattered dishes. Walsh let the image speak for itself for a long moment. Then she continued. This wasn't random. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was planned, premeditated, executed with chilling efficiency by the defendant, Mason Carter, who was 14 years old at the time. Age doesn't erase intent. Age doesn't erase evil. And the evidence will prove beyond any doubt that Mason Carter is guilty. The first week of trial focused on establishing the timeline and the forensic evidence. Detective Mills testified about the investigation, walking the jury through each discovery. The security footage was played multiple times. Frame by frame, they watched Mason walk toward the Henderson house carrying that duffel bag. His face was clearly visible in 2 separate cameras. There was no question it was him. The timestamp showed 7:21. The medical examiner had placed time of death between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Mason had time to walk there, commit the murders, and walk home. And that's exactly what the evidence suggested he did. The forensic expert took the stand next. Dr. Lisa Warren had 30 years of experience in criminal forensics. She explained the fingerprint evidence in terms the jury could understand. The partial thumbprint found on the baseball bat matched Mason Carter's right thumb. The probability of it being someone else was less than 1 in 10 billion. She showed enlarged photos of the print comparison. Ridge by ridge, point by point, perfect match. She then moved to the DNA evidence. Skin cells found under Sarah Henderson's fingernails contained Mason's genetic markers. Sarah had fought back. She had clawed at her attacker, and she had left proof of his identity literally under her nails. The baseball bat itself was entered into evidence. Sealed in a clear plastic bag, dried blood still visible on the wood and duct tape handle. The courtroom went silent as it was passed to the jury for examination. Several jurors handled it carefully, their faces showing revulsion. This was the weapon that had ended 3 lives. 17 blows to David, 12 to Sarah, 9 to Emma. Each impact documented in the autopsy reports. Each one delivered with enough force to cause catastrophic injuries. Dr. Warren explained that the attack pattern showed consistency and control. This wasn't a frenzied rage. This was systematic. The attacker had moved from victim to victim with purpose. The medical examiner, Dr. Chen, testified next. His voice remained steady and professional, but his hands trembled slightly as he described the injuries. David Henderson had defensive wounds on his forearms. He had tried to protect himself and his family. Sarah Henderson had bruising on her wrists and arms consistent with trying to grab the bat or shield herself. Emma Henderson's injuries were concentrated on her head. She had been struck while on the ground, likely while trying to reach her father. Dr. Chen paused after describing Emma's wounds. He took a sip of water. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the hardest journalists looked shaken. The jury looked at Mason. He sat there expressionless, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, but showing no reaction to the testimony. The prosecution played the interrogation video next. The jury watched as Detective Mills showed Mason the security footage, and he claimed it wasn't him. They watched as she presented the fingerprint evidence, and he showed annoyance rather than fear. And then they heard his final words before requesting a lawyer. "You can't prove anything," said with a smile, with arrogance, with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Walsh paused the video on that smile. Let the jury see it frozen on the screen. "This is not a confused child," she said. "This is not someone who made a terrible mistake. This is someone who planned, executed, and felt satisfied with his crimes." The most damaging evidence came on day 8 of the trial. Walsh introduced Mason's laptop, seized during the arrest. A digital forensics expert testified about the browser history, thousands of searches about violent crimes, how to avoid leaving fingerprints, how long DNA evidence lasts, whether minors can be sentenced to life in prison. The searches dated back 6 months before the murders. Mason had been researching, planning, educating himself. He had watched videos about famous killers, read case files about unsolved crimes. He had been preparing for this. And the most chilling search of all, found just 3 days before the murders. Can a 14-year-old go to adult prison? He had known what he was going to do. He had accepted the possible consequences, and he had done it anyway. The defense's turn came in the 3rd week of trial. Thomas Brennan stood before the jury knowing he was fighting an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensics were airtight, but he had a job to do. He called a child psychologist to the stand. Dr. Patricia Morgan specialized in adolescent development. She testified about teenage brain function, about how the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until age 25. She explained impulse control issues, peer pressure susceptibility, the inability of young people to fully understand long-term consequences. It was textbook defense strategy. Make the jury see Mason as a child who couldn't help himself rather than a calculating killer. But Walsh dismantled the argument on cross-examination. She asked Dr. Morgan about premeditation, about research and planning, about wrapping duct tape around a weapon weeks in advance, about studying forensics and case files for months. "Do these actions suggest impulse control problems?" Walsh asked, "or do they suggest careful planning?" Dr. Morgan hesitated. She admitted that the level of preparation was unusual for someone with developmental issues. Walsh pressed further. "In your professional opinion, could someone with impulse control problems successfully hide their actions, lie to investigators, and show no remorse?" Dr. Morgan looked uncomfortable. She conceded that the behavior pattern suggested something beyond normal adolescent development. Brennan called character witnesses next. Mason's 8th-grade English teacher testified that he was quiet but never violent. A neighbor said he seemed like a normal kid. His mother took the stand, and the entire courtroom held its breath. Linda Carter looked like a shell of the woman she had been 6 months ago. Her hands shook as she was sworn in. Brennan asked her gentle questions about Mason's childhood. She described him as a sweet boy when he was little, how he liked drawing and building with blocks, how he helped her around the house. But Walsh's cross-examination was brutal in its simplicity. She asked Linda about the months before the murders. Did you know what websites Mason was visiting? No. Did you know he had stolen a baseball bat from school? No. Did you know he was planning to kill 3 people? Linda broke down sobbing. No, she whispered. I didn't know anything. The prosecution called rebuttal witnesses. A classmate testified that Mason had once joked about how easy it would be to hurt someone and get away with it. Another student remembered Mason saying that people who cry about violence are weak. These weren't the words of a confused child. These were red flags that everyone had missed or dismissed. The school counselor admitted she had never been asked to see Mason despite several teachers noting his emotional detachment. The system had failed to intervene. But that didn't make Mason less responsible for his choices. It just meant more people would carry guilt for the rest of their lives. Closing arguments happened on a Friday. The courtroom was packed again, every seat filled. Walsh stood before the jury and spoke without notes. She reminded them of Emma Henderson's dreams, of David Henderson's dedication to his students, of Sarah Henderson's commitment to saving lives. She reminded them of the security footage, the fingerprint, the DNA, the browser history, the premeditation. Mason Carter chose to walk into that house, she said. He chose to pick up that bat. He chose to swing it again and again and again, 43 times total. 43 separate decisions to end human lives. That's not impulse. That's not confusion. That's murder. And the law demands accountability. Brennan made his final plea. He talked about Mason's age, about the failure of adults to recognize warning signs, about the possibility of rehabilitation. He asked the jury to remember that Mason was still a child, that sending a 14-year-old to adult prison for life was a decision that would haunt them. "Look at him," Brennan said, gesturing to Mason. "He's just a boy." But the jury looked at Mason and several of them seemed to recoil, because Mason wasn't showing remorse or fear. He was watching the proceedings with that same detached curiosity, like he was observing an experiment rather than fighting for his life. The mask had never slipped, and that terrified people more than any evidence could. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 48 hours of weighing evidence, debating testimony, wrestling with the reality of convicting a teenager of triple murder. They requested to see the interrogation video again. They asked to review the browser history evidence. They wanted clarity on the legal definition of premeditation. Judge Rhodes patiently answered their questions and sent them back to deliberate. Finally, on Sunday afternoon, they sent word they had reached a verdict. The courthouse was recalled into session. The gallery filled within minutes. News broke on social media before anyone had even entered the courtroom. The wait was over. Mason entered the courtroom for the last time as a defendant whose fate was undecided. He wore the same oversized suit. His hair had grown longer during the trial. He looked even younger somehow. Linda sat in her usual spot, rosary beads wrapped around her fingers despite not having been to church in years. The Henderson family sat together, arms linked, preparing for whatever came next. The jury filed in, none of them looking at Mason. That was a bad sign for the defense. Juries that won't look at the defendant have usually convicted him. Judge Rhodes asked the foreperson to stand. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom held its collective breath. "On the charge of first-degree murder of David Henderson, how do you find?" "Guilty." Linda's sob echoed through the silence. "On the charge of first-degree murder of Sarah Henderson, how do you find?" "Guilty." Someone from the Henderson family whispered, "Thank you." On the charge of first-degree murder of Emma Henderson, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others wept. Judge Rhodes banged her gavel, calling for order. Mason sat perfectly still. No reaction, no emotion. Just that same empty stare he had worn throughout the entire trial. Brennan put his head in his hands. He had known this was coming, but hearing it still hurt. Judge Rhodes scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. She remanded Mason to custody until then. As the guards moved to take him away, Linda stood up and called out to him, "Mason, I love you. Please look at me." Mason paused. He turned his head slowly and met his mother's eyes. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not love, not sadness. Something darker. Something that made Linda take a step back despite herself. Then he turned away and let the guards lead him out. That was the last time Linda would see her son outside of a prison visiting room. The last time she would have any illusion that the child she raised still existed somewhere inside the monster he had become. The 2 weeks between verdict and sentencing felt like 2 years to Linda Carter. She stopped going to work. She couldn't face people, couldn't handle the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere. The grocery store, the gas station, her own neighborhood. Everywhere she went, people recognized her as that mother, the one who raised a killer, the one who somehow didn't see what was growing in her own home. Her co-workers sent sympathy cards that felt more like accusations. "We're praying for you. We're so sorry." But underneath the polite words was the unspoken question. How did you not know? Linda asked herself that question 1,000 times a day. She sat in Mason's empty bedroom and tried to find answers in the spaces between his belongings. His posters on the wall, his unmade bed, his desk where he had sat and researched murder while she worked herself to exhaustion to provide for him. She opened his closet and found the dark hoodie hanging there, the one he had worn that night. Police had taken the original as evidence, but he had others just like it. How many times had she washed these clothes without knowing what he had done while wearing them? How many times had she kissed his forehead goodnight while he planned his next move? The guilt was suffocating. Linda replayed every moment of Mason's childhood looking for the signs she missed. He had been quiet as a baby, slower to smile than other infants, but the pediatrician said some babies were just more serious. He didn't play well with other toddlers, preferring to line up his toys rather than share them. But the daycare teacher said he was just independent. In elementary school, he never formed close friendships. But Linda told herself he was introverted, thoughtful, different from other kids in a good way. Every red flag she had explained away, every warning sign she had rationalized, because facing the truth meant admitting her child was broken. And what mother wants to believe that? She thought about Mason's father. Derek had left when Mason was 3 years old, just walked out one day and never came back. No calls, no birthday cards, no child support. Linda had been devastated but also determined to prove she could raise a son alone. She worked harder, sacrificed more, told herself that love would be enough. But maybe Mason needed more than love. Maybe he needed intervention she couldn't provide. Maybe Derek's abandonment had damaged something fundamental in Mason that she never recognized. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept Linda awake at night, maybe Mason was born this way. Maybe nothing she did or didn't do would have changed what he became. The hate mail started arriving during the second week. Letters from strangers blaming her for the Henderson murders. "You raised a monster. You should be in prison too. How does it feel knowing your son destroyed a family?" Linda read every letter, absorbing the venom like penance. Part of her agreed with them. She was guilty, not of murder, but of blindness, of working too much and seeing too little. of being so exhausted from survival that she failed to notice her son was becoming someone capable of unspeakable evil. The letters said she should have known, and they were right. A mother should know her own child. Linda's sister Rachel came to stay with her. Rachel lived 2 states away, but dropped everything when she heard the verdict. She found Linda sitting on the kitchen floor surrounded by old photo albums, pictures of Mason as a baby, Mason's first day of school, Mason blowing out birthday candles. "Who was this child in the photos?" Rachel asked gently, sitting beside her sister. Linda stared at a picture of 5-year-old Mason smiling at the camera. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. "I thought I knew him. I thought I knew everything about him. But I didn't know anything at all." Rachel held her while she cried, but there was no comfort that could reach the depth of Linda's pain. The victim impact statements were scheduled for the sentencing hearing. Linda knew the Henderson family would speak. She knew they would direct their rage at Mason. She knew she would have to sit there and hear about the lives he destroyed. But what she didn't expect was the call from Sarah Henderson's brother, Michael. He asked to meet with Linda before the hearing. Linda almost refused. What could she possibly say to this man whose sister Mason had murdered? But something compelled her to agree. They met at a coffee shop outside of town where no one would recognize them. Michael sat across from Linda and studied her face. She looked 10 years older than her age, hollowed out, destroyed from the inside. He had come here angry, ready to confront the woman who raised the boy who killed his sister. But seeing Linda's pain, seeing the genuine devastation in her eyes, some of his rage deflated. "I need to understand," he said finally. "Did you see anything? Any sign at all that he was capable of this?" Linda's hands shook around her coffee cup. "I've asked myself that every minute of every day," she said. "And the answer is no. Or maybe yes. Maybe I saw things and told myself they were normal. Maybe I was too tired or too scared to admit the truth. I failed your sister. I failed all of them. I'm sorry." The words felt pathetically inadequate. Michael was silent for a long time. Then he said something Linda never expected. "I don't forgive him. I will never forgive him. But I don't blame you. You didn't kill them. You didn't plan it or help him or cover it up. You're a victim too, in a different way." Linda shook her head. "I'm his mother. I should have protected them from him." But Michael reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "You can't protect the world from something you don't know exists. Mason fooled everyone. Teachers, counselors, neighbors. Police never had a file on him. He was a ghost. And ghosts are impossible to catch until they decide to become visible." Michael left shortly after. Linda sat alone in that coffee shop and cried. His kindness somehow hurt worse than the hate mail. The night before sentencing, Linda visited Mason at the Juvenile Detention Center one last time. She sat behind the plexiglass partition and waited for them to bring him out. When he appeared, she barely recognized him. He had grown taller. His face had lost the last traces of childhood softness. He sat down and picked up the phone. They stared at each other for a moment. "Mason," Linda said, her voice breaking, "tomorrow the judge is going to sentence you. This is your last chance to tell me why. Why did you do it?" Mason tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a stranger. "Does it matter?" he asked. "They're dead either way." Linda felt something crack inside her chest. "Where did I go wrong?" she asked. "What did I do that made you this way?" Mason actually smiled, a small, cold smile that held no warmth. "You didn't do anything, Mom. This isn't about you. It was never about you. I wanted to see if I could. I wanted to know what it felt like. And now I know." Linda stared at her son, searching desperately for any trace of remorse, of humanity, of the baby she had held 14 years ago. But there was nothing there. Just emptiness. Just a void where a soul should be. "I love you," she whispered. Mason shrugged. "I know," he said. Then he hung up the phone and gestured to the guard that he was done. He didn't look back as they led him away. Linda sat there alone, the phone still pressed to her ear, and realized she was mourning a son who had never really existed at all. The court-appointed psychologist's report arrived 3 days before sentencing. Dr. Raymond Foster had spent 8 hours over 4 sessions evaluating Mason Carter. His findings would influence the judge's decision on whether life in prison for a 14-year-old was justice or cruelty. Linda obtained a copy through Mason's lawyer. She sat at her kitchen table and forced herself to read every page. What she found was more terrifying than any nightmare she had imagined. The report detailed a psychological profile that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Mason exhibited clear signs of antisocial personality disorder, lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional connections, superficial charm masking complete indifference to others' suffering. Dr. Foster had administered multiple psychological tests. The results were consistent across every measure. Mason scored in the extreme range for narcissistic traits. He viewed other people as objects rather than humans, tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. When asked about the Henderson family, Mason showed no physiological stress responses. His heart rate remained steady. His pupils didn't dilate. His skin conductivity didn't change. These were the metrics of someone discussing a movie plot, not their own murders. Dr. Foster noted that in 30 years of practice, he had rarely seen such complete emotional detachment in someone so young. Most juvenile offenders showed some capacity for remorse, even if buried under layers of defense mechanisms. Mason showed none. The report explored Mason's childhood for environmental factors that might explain his development. Single-parent household. Father abandoned the family early. Financial stress. Mother working multiple jobs. These circumstances created opportunities for Mason to act without supervision. But they didn't create Mason's psychology. Dr. Foster interviewed Linda extensively. She described a child who never bonded properly with her as an infant, who never showed typical attachment behaviors. Mason didn't cry when she left, didn't smile when she returned. As a toddler, he never sought comfort when hurt, never seemed to need affection or approval. Linda had attributed this to independence and resilience. Dr. Foster recognized it as something far more troubling. The elementary school years revealed a pattern of concerning behavior that had been overlooked or minimized. In first grade, Mason was caught pulling legs off insects during recess. The teacher addressed it as normal childhood curiosity about nature. In third grade, a classmate's pet hamster died after Mason volunteered to care for it over spring break. The death was ruled accidental. The hamster supposedly escaped and fell downstairs. But Dr. Foster uncovered something Linda hadn't known. Another student had seen Mason deliberately drop the cage. When confronted, Mason had cried and apologized convincingly. Even at 8 years old, he knew how to perform emotion he didn't feel. Middle school brought escalation that adults consistently failed to recognize. A boy who bullied Mason in 6th grade suddenly stopped. Other students whispered that Mason had threatened him with something so specific and disturbing that the bully transferred schools. But no teacher ever investigated. Mason maintained good enough grades to avoid scrutiny. He never caused disruptions in class. He flew under every radar by being exactly unremarkable enough. Dr. Foster's report included interviews with former classmates who, in hindsight, remembered moments that made them uncomfortable. The way Mason watched people, how he seemed to study reactions rather than participate in them. One girl described feeling like a specimen under Mason's observation, but she had never told anyone because it seemed too vague to report. The report detailed Mason's online activity beyond what had been presented at trial. His searches weren't just about avoiding capture. they revealed a fascination with power and control. He had spent hours on forums where people discussed true crime cases. He rarely posted, but when he did, his comments focused on how criminals made mistakes rather than the horror of their crimes. He criticized killers for being sloppy, for getting emotional, for leaving evidence. He was learning from their failures, preparing himself to succeed where they hadn't. One chilling post from 2 months before the murders simply said, "The key is choosing victims who won't be missed until it's too late. Planning matters more than execution." Dr. Foster's conclusion was stark and damning. Mason Carter demonstrated a complete absence of conscience. He understood right and wrong intellectually, but felt no moral or emotional connection to these concepts. He knew killing was illegal, but felt no internal prohibition against it. The murders weren't committed in rage or fear. They were committed out of curiosity and a desire for mastery. Mason wanted to prove to himself that he could plan and execute a complex crime. The Henderson family wasn't chosen for personal reasons. They were chosen because they represented an achievable target. Their deaths were simply the price of Mason's education. This made him fundamentally different from typical juvenile offenders, and, in Dr. Foster's professional opinion, unlikely to be rehabilitated through traditional means. The report recommended maximum security placement regardless of sentencing. Mason represented a significant risk to others. He had already demonstrated the capacity and willingness to kill. He had shown no remorse or recognition that his actions were morally wrong. He possessed above-average intelligence and the ability to manipulate others through performed emotions. Standard juvenile rehabilitation programs, which relied on developing empathy and moral reasoning, would be ineffective. Mason didn't lack understanding of these concepts. He simply didn't care about them. The only thing constraining his behavior was potential consequences. And even those constraints had proven insufficient given his decision to commit triple murder despite understanding he could be caught. Linda finished reading the report as the sun set outside her kitchen window. The pages blurred through her tears. She had spent 14 years loving a child incapable of love, sacrificing for someone who viewed her sacrifices as weaknesses to exploit. Every tender moment she remembered, every time she thought they had connected, had been Mason performing the role of a son. He had learned early what mothers wanted to see and gave her exactly that. Just enough affection to avoid suspicion, just enough normalcy to blend in. He had worn his humanity like a costume, and she had never seen through the disguise. The boy she loved had never existed. There was only Mason, and Mason was empty. Mason's first night in the adult county jail came after sentencing. Juvenile detention had been temporary. This was permanent. The intake officer processed him like any other inmate despite his age. Strip search, delousing shower, prison-issue clothing that hung loose on his thin frame. They took his fingerprints again, photographed him from multiple angles, assigned him a number. He was no longer Mason Carter, 14-year-old boy. He was inmate 743928. The officer noticed that Mason went through the humiliating process without complaint or emotion. Most first-timers, especially kids, showed fear, anger, something. Mason just followed instructions with the same blank expression he wore everywhere. The cell block was different from juvenile detention in every way. Louder, harsher, filled with men who had committed terrible crimes and had no patience for weakness. Mason was placed in protective custody initially. The prison administration knew what happened to young inmates in general population, especially those convicted of murdering children. Emma Henderson had been 12 years old. That made Mason a target for a particular kind of prison justice. Men serving life sentences for drug crimes or robbery still maintained a code. Crimes against children violated that code. Mason would need to prove himself or spend decades in isolation. The cell was 6 by 8 feet, concrete walls, A metal bunk bolted to the floor, a toilet with no seat, a small metal sink. One narrow window near the ceiling showed a slice of sky. Mason sat on the bunk and looked around his new home. This was where he would spend the rest of his life. The judge had made that clear during sentencing. Life without possibility of parole. Mason would die in a place like this, decades from now, never again experiencing freedom. Most people would break under the weight of that reality. But Mason's face showed nothing. He lay down on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. Within minutes he was asleep. The other inmates learned about him quickly. News travels fast in prison. A 14-year-old sentenced to life for triple murder. Some were impressed. Some were disgusted. A few saw opportunity. Mason was young, small, vulnerable. Perfect prey for those who enjoyed exerting power over the weak. But Mason had learned something important during his brief time in juvenile detention. Predators recognize other predators. On his third day during recreation hour, an older inmate named Marcus approached him. Marcus was serving 25 years for armed robbery. He outweighed Mason by 100 pounds and had a reputation for running protection rackets. "Kid," he said, "you need friends in here. I can be your friend. For a price." Mason looked up at Marcus with those empty eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't show the fear Marcus expected. Instead, Mason smiled, that same cold smile that had unsettled everyone during his trial. "I don't need friends," Mason said quietly, "and I don't pay for anything." Marcus laughed, thinking this kid had no idea how things worked. He reached out to grab Mason's shoulder, a gesture meant to intimidate, to establish dominance. But Mason didn't react with submission. He reacted with words that stopped Marcus cold. "I know about your daughter," Mason said. "She visits every other Saturday, lives on Maple Street, apartment 214, goes to Jefferson High School." Marcus went pale. "How the hell did you know that?" Mason had learned the information from another inmate, traded for commissary items. But Marcus didn't need to know that. The point was made. Marcus could hurt Mason physically, but Mason could reach beyond these walls, could threaten what Marcus cared about, could weaponize information in ways that fists couldn't defend against. Marcus stepped back. "You're crazy," he muttered. Mason's smile widened slightly. "Yes," he said, "I am. Remember that." Marcus walked away and spread the word. "Leave the kid alone. He's not right in the head." And in prison, where survival often depended on understanding danger, not right in the head was the most effective protection Mason could have. The prison psychologist, Dr. Helen Martinez, was assigned to evaluate Mason monthly. Standard protocol for juvenile lifers. She had worked with violent offenders for 15 years but found Mason uniquely challenging. Most inmates either denied their crimes, blamed circumstances, or showed some form of emotional response. Mason did none of these things. He answered her questions with clinical detachment. When asked if he thought about the Henderson family, he said sometimes. When asked what he thought about them, he said he wondered if he could have done things differently. Dr. Martinez felt a flicker of hope. "Different how?" she asked. Mason tilted his head. "Not killed them on a Thursday," he said. "Weekends would have given me more time before discovery." Dr. Martinez documented Mason's complete lack of remorse. She tried different therapeutic approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed care, moral development exercises. Nothing penetrated. Mason participated in sessions because refusing would mark him as uncooperative, but he engaged with therapy the way someone might engage with a mildly interesting puzzle, intellectually curious but emotionally disconnected. He learned the right words to say. He understood what responses would earn positive notes in his file. But Dr. Martinez could see through the performance. She wrote in her evaluations that Mason represented the most challenging case of her career. A mind that understood morality but felt no moral weight. a person who could fake redemption without ever experiencing it. The reality of prison began settling in after the first month. The constant noise, the lack of privacy, the rigid schedule. Wake at 5, breakfast at 6, work detail or education programs during the day, recreation in small, controlled increments, dinner at 5, lockdown at 7, every day identical to the one before. For someone serving decades, this monotony became its own form of torture. But Mason adapted. He found structure comforting. Predictability meant fewer variables to manage. He kept to himself mostly, did his assigned work without complaint, attended the mandatory education classes. He was a model inmate in every measurable way. But the guards learned to watch him carefully. There was something unsettling about a teenager who showed no signs of struggling with life imprisonment. Mason received letters occasionally. Most were from true crime enthusiasts who wrote to infamous killers. Some wanted autographs. Some wanted to understand his psychology. A few were disturbing admiration letters from people who saw Mason as some kind of dark hero. Mason read these letters with mild interest but rarely responded. The only person he wrote to regularly was his mother. Linda visited once a month, sitting across from him in the visiting room, trying desperately to find her son in the stranger who wore his face. Mason's letters to her were brief and functional. He was fine. The food was adequate. He had no complaints. Never did he write about regret or redemption or the life he had taken from 3 innocent people. He wrote like someone filing a status report. And Linda read each letter searching for humanity that wasn't there. The Henderson family home stood empty for 8 months after the murders. Sarah's brother Michael had been given the keys by the estate lawyer. He was supposed to clean it out, prepare it for sale. But he couldn't bring himself to enter. Every time he drove past, he saw the crime scene tape that had long been removed. He saw his sister's car in the driveway. He saw Emma's bike leaning against the garage. The house looked normal from the outside, like the family might come home any moment. But they never would. Finally, in November, Michael forced himself to go inside. He brought his wife and 2 friends for support. They opened the door, and the smell of cleaning chemicals hit them immediately. The county had hired a specialty company to remediate the dining room, but no amount of bleach could erase what had happened there. They worked in silence, packing up lives that had been interrupted mid-sentence. David's lesson plans were still on his desk. He had been preparing a unit on probability for after spring break. Sarah's nursing textbooks were stacked on the coffee table. She had been studying for a certification exam. Emma's homework was spread across the kitchen counter, a math worksheet with problems half finished. Her handwriting was careful and neat. She had been working on number 7 when she heard her father come home. She had put down her pencil and gone to greet him. She never picked that pencil up again. Michael stood in the kitchen holding that worksheet and broke down completely. His wife found him on the floor sobbing, clutching a 12-year-old's math homework like it was the most precious thing in the world. Packing Emma's room was impossible. Michael's wife Rebecca volunteered to do it alone. The stuffed animals, the animal posters, the books about veterinary medicine checked out from the library and now overdue, the nail polish on her dresser, the diary hidden under her mattress that Rebecca couldn't bring herself to read. These were the artifacts of a life barely begun, a girl who should have had 70 more years, who should have gone to high school and college, who should have opened that veterinary practice she dreamed about, who should have fallen in love and had her own children and grown old watching sunsets with the person she chose, all of that potential erased by a teenager with a baseball bat. Rebecca packed each item carefully, tears streaming down her face, and wondered how the world could be so unbearably cruel. David's parents, both in their 70s, never recovered from losing their only son. His mother, Patricia, had a stroke 3 weeks after the funeral. The doctors said it was brought on by stress and grief. She survived but lost mobility on her left side and most of her ability to speak clearly. She spent her remaining days in a nursing home, looking at photos of David and trying to form words that wouldn't come. His father, Robert, visited her every day. He would hold her hand and talk about David's childhood. Remember when he won the science fair? Remember his first day teaching? Remember how proud we were? Patricia would squeeze his hand and cry. Robert died of a heart attack 6 months later. The death certificate said cardiac arrest, but everyone who knew him understood he had died of a broken heart. Sarah's elderly mother, Ellen, moved in with Michael after the murders. She couldn't live alone anymore. The grief had hollowed her out. She stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake up screaming, reliving the moment she learned her daughter was gone. Michael would find her in Sarah's old bedroom, holding clothes that still smelled faintly of her perfume, whispering conversations with a ghost. Ellen's health declined rapidly. She developed pneumonia that winter. The doctors said she could fight it with proper treatment, but Ellen refused. She was tired of fighting, tired of living in a world without her daughter and granddaughter. She died in February, surrounded by family, and her last words were, "I'm coming, Sarah. Wait for me." The community of Riverside tried to heal, but the wound ran too deep. The Henderson murders shattered the town's sense of safety. Parents stopped letting children play outside unsupervised. Neighbors who used to leave doors unlocked installed security systems. The elementary school hired 2 additional counselors to help students process the trauma. Emma had been friends with dozens of classmates. They had watched her grow up, played with her at recess, invited her to birthday parties. Now they attended her funeral instead of her 13th birthday. Child psychologists worked overtime helping kids understand why someone their own age could kill. How do you explain evil to a 10-year-old? How do you restore innocence once it's been taken? The animal shelter where Emma volunteered created a memorial in her honor. They planted a garden with a stone bench. Emma's Garden, the plaque read, in memory of a girl who loved every creature. The shelter staff planted flowers Emma had mentioned liking. They installed a small fountain. On weekends, children would come to read to the shelter animals in Emma's memory. She had done the same thing, reading to the cats and dogs because she believed it calmed them. The tradition continued without her. Every time a volunteer sat in Emma's garden with a book and a rescue dog, they were keeping her spirit alive. But it also reminded everyone that she should have been there herself, should have been reading those books and petting those dogs and growing into the remarkable woman she was meant to become. David's school retired his classroom. Room 214 remained empty for the rest of that academic year. Students and teachers left flowers outside the door, notes thanking him for his kindness, drawings and cards expressing what he had meant to them. The school board eventually decided to convert the room into a mathematics resource center, the David Henderson Math Lab. They filled it with computers and tutoring tables and learning resources. A portrait of David hung on the wall, smiling in his terrible dad joke t-shirt. Students who struggled with math could come there for extra help, just like David had always offered. It was a beautiful tribute. But every teacher who worked in that room felt his absence like a physical weight. The man who should have been there teaching wasn't, and he never would be again. Sarah's hospital held a memorial service on what would have been her 40th birthday. Co-workers shared stories about her compassion and dedication. Patients she had saved sent letters describing how she had impacted their lives. One elderly man wrote about how Sarah had held his hand during a frightening procedure and sang to him until he calmed down. A young mother described how Sarah had fought to save her premature baby when other nurses had given up hope. That baby was now 3 years old and healthy. All because Sarah refused to quit. The stories painted a picture of a woman who embodied everything noble about nursing, but she wasn't there to hear them. She was gone, taken by senseless violence, and the world was demonstrably worse without her in it. Linda Carter heard about these memorials through news reports and community updates. Each one was another knife in her heart. Her son had stolen so much more than 3 lives. He had stolen parents from their children, children from their parents, a teacher from his students, a nurse from her patients, a young girl's entire future. The ripples of Mason's crime spread outward infinitely, touching hundreds of lives, destroying peace and security and innocence. Linda wrote letters of apology to the Henderson family. Michael responded once, briefly, saying he didn't blame her but couldn't forgive Mason. The other family members never replied. Linda understood. What could she possibly say that would matter? Sorry seemed like an insult, an inadequate word for an unforgivable act. So she suffered in silence, carrying the weight of her son's evil, knowing she would carry it until the day she died. The Mason Carter case sparked national debates about juvenile justice. Legal experts appeared on news programs arguing both sides. Some believed that trying a 14-year-old as an adult violated the spirit of juvenile law. The system was designed to rehabilitate young offenders, not warehouse them for life. Children's brains weren't fully developed. Their capacity for change exceeded adults. Sentencing Mason to die in prison meant giving up on the possibility of redemption. But others argued that some crimes were so heinous that age became irrelevant. Mason had planned these murders, researched them, executed them with precision. He showed no remorse. The evidence suggested he would kill again if given the opportunity. Public safety demanded permanent removal from society. Judge Margaret Rhodes became the face of this debate. She received thousands of letters after sentencing. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of cruelty. One letter from a child psychology professor argued that Rhodes had failed to consider developmental science. Another from a victims' rights advocate thanked her for prioritizing justice over misplaced sympathy. Rhodes read every letter but responded to none. She had made her decision based on evidence and law. Mason's age had been a factor. She had weighed it carefully. But the premeditation, the violence, the complete absence of remorse, and the psychological evaluations all pointed to one conclusion. Mason Carter represented a clear and permanent danger. Releasing him at 21, as juvenile sentencing might allow, was unthinkable. The case revealed systemic failures that haunted everyone involved. Mason had exhibited warning signs for years. Teachers had noted his emotional detachment. Classmates had felt uncomfortable around him. The incident with the hamster. The threats that made a bully transfer schools. The disturbing online activity. Each red flag existed in isolation, known to different people who never connected the dots. Schools lacked integrated systems for tracking behavioral concerns across years and teachers. Mental health resources were stretched too thin to proactively assess every quiet, unremarkable student. Mason had exploited the gaps perfectly. He stayed just under every threshold that might trigger intervention. He was the system's nightmare scenario, a predator hiding in plain sight. Linda Carter filed a lawsuit against the school district 6 months after Mason's sentencing, not for money, but for accountability and change. Her lawyer argued that multiple staff members had observed concerning behavior, but no mechanism existed to aggregate and act on these observations. If the school counselor had known about the hamster incident, the threats, and the emotional detachment altogether, perhaps intervention would have occurred. Perhaps Mason would have received psychological evaluation. Perhaps the Henderson family would still be alive. The school district's lawyers argued they had followed all protocols. No single incident rose to the level requiring action. They couldn't evaluate every socially awkward teenager. The case was eventually settled out of court, with the district agreeing to implement a new behavioral tracking system. But that wouldn't bring anyone back. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, used the case to advocate for legal reforms. She proposed legislation requiring psychological evaluation of any juvenile charged with violent felonies before charging decisions were made. The evaluation wouldn't determine guilt, but would inform whether adult or juvenile prosecution was appropriate. Critics argued this added expense and delay to an overburdened system. Walsh countered that cases like Mason's demanded this investment. Not every 14-year-old murderer was Mason Carter. Some killed in self-defense, some killed under peer pressure or abuse. Some genuinely could be rehabilitated. But those who shared Mason's psychological profile needed to be identified and handled differently. The legislation passed 2 years later, too late for the Hendersons, but potentially life-saving for future victims. Defense attorney Thomas Brennan struggled with the case's aftermath. He had done his job, provided the best defense possible under impossible circumstances. But the outcome weighed on him. At night he wondered if there had been something more he could have done. Some argument he missed, some expert he didn't call. Logically, he knew the evidence was overwhelming. Mason's own behavior had sealed his fate. But Brennan had watched a 14-year-old boy get sentenced to die in prison. That was hard to accept, regardless of guilt. He started volunteering with juvenile justice reform organizations, working to prevent other children from reaching the point where life sentences became the only option. It was his way of processing the trauma of representing Mason Carter. The case files eventually made their way to law schools as teaching materials. Professor Sandra Kim at Georgetown used the case in her criminal law seminar. Students debated whether Mason's sentence was justice or vengeance. They analyzed the psychological reports, studied the evidence, wrestled with the question of whether anyone, regardless of age or crime, should be sentenced to life without parole. The discussions were heated. Some students argued that society had failed Mason long before he killed. Others insisted that 3 innocent people deserved justice more than 1 guilty child deserved mercy. Professor Kim never revealed her personal opinion. She wanted students to grapple with the complexity, to understand that sometimes the law confronts questions with no satisfying answers. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit studied Mason's case for patterns. Special Agent David Morrison, who specialized in juvenile offenders, found Mason's profile deeply concerning. Most juvenile killers showed identifiable triggers: abuse, neglect, psychological breaks, peer pressure. Mason showed none of these. He appeared to kill out of pure curiosity and a desire to test his capabilities. This made him more similar to adult serial killers than typical juvenile offenders. Morrison wrote a paper arguing that current risk assessment tools for juveniles failed to identify Mason-type offenders, kids who weren't reactive but proactive, who weren't damaged but fundamentally different. The paper recommended new screening protocols for identifying these rare but extremely dangerous individuals. Early identification might allow for intervention before violence occurred. Detective Sarah Mills attended a national conference on juvenile homicide 2 years after Mason's conviction. She presented the Henderson case to an audience of law enforcement professionals. During the question period, a detective from Oregon described a similar case. A 13-year-old who had murdered a neighbor family with premeditation and no apparent motive. The psychological profile matched Mason's almost exactly. Mills felt chills. If there were 2, there were likely more. Children who looked normal but lacked fundamental human empathy, who viewed violence as problem-solving, who would kill if given opportunity and perceived safety. The conference led to the creation of a database tracking juvenile offenders with these specific characteristics. The goal was pattern recognition, early warning systems, prevention rather than punishment. But for the Henderson family and others like them, these efforts came too late. 3 years after Mason's sentencing, a documentary filmmaker named Alex Chen requested permission to interview him. Chen had made acclaimed films about criminal psychology and believed Mason's case represented something important that society needed to understand. The prison administration approved the request. Mason agreed without hesitation. He was 19 years old now, taller, his face losing the last softness of adolescence. Chen arrived with a small crew and set up cameras in a secure visiting room. Mason sat across from him, hands folded, expression neutral. Chen started with an obvious question. "Why did you kill the Henderson family?" Mason tilted his head slightly, considering. "Because I wanted to see if I could," he said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion. Chen pressed for deeper answers. "But why them specifically? What did they do to you?" Mason almost smiled. "Nothing. They didn't do anything. That was the point. I needed subjects who wouldn't be connected to me. No personal relationship, no obvious motive. Clean execution." Chen felt his skin crawl. "You're talking about human beings like they were a science experiment." Mason shrugged. "Isn't that what they were? An experiment in planning and execution. I wanted to know if I could accomplish a complex task without getting caught. I made one mistake, the thumbprint. Otherwise, the plan was solid." Chen realized with horror that Mason felt no guilt about the murders, only mild regret about the technical flaw that led to his capture. The documentary explored the question everyone asked: was Mason born this way or made this way? Chen interviewed Linda Carter, who looked frail and haunted. She described Mason's infancy, the lack of normal attachment behaviors, but she also blamed herself. "Maybe if I had been home more. Maybe if his father had stayed. Maybe if I had seen the signs." Chen spoke with Dr. Raymond Foster, the psychologist who evaluated Mason. Foster was blunt. "Some people are born without the capacity for empathy. We don't fully understand why. Genetics play a role. Brain structure abnormalities can be factors. But environment doesn't create sociopathy. It might shape how it manifests." Linda Carter didn't create her son's psychology. She just failed to recognize it. Chen interviewed Emma's best friend, now 15 years old. Kayla Rodriguez still had nightmares about losing Emma. She kept Emma's friendship bracelet in a box by her bed. She talked about how Emma had been the kindest person she knew, how she had stood up for kids who were bullied, how she had cried when her goldfish died. Emma had felt everything so deeply, and Mason had felt nothing at all. How could two people the same age be so fundamentally different? Kayla asked Chen. How could one be so full of life and the other so empty? Chen had no answer. The randomness of it was terrifying. That Mason happened to live 3 blocks from the Hendersons, that they happened to leave their door unlocked, that evil and innocence collided on one terrible Thursday night. The documentary examined whether Mason could have been stopped. Chen obtained footage of Mason in elementary school. Classroom videos showed a quiet boy sitting alone while other children played. His face was blank, even when others laughed. Teachers' comments on report cards described him as withdrawn but polite. No behavioral problems, average grades, nothing that screamed danger. Chen interviewed the 6th grade teacher who had heard about Mason's threat to the bully. She admitted she should have reported it, but Mason had seemed so harmless, so small and quiet. She couldn't reconcile that boy with someone capable of truly hurting others. Her failure to act haunted her daily. Maybe if she had spoken up, someone would have evaluated Mason. Maybe the Hendersons would be alive. Chen also explored the question of evil itself. Was Mason evil or sick? The distinction mattered to many people. If Mason had a brain abnormality, if his psychology was the result of biology beyond his control, did that change his moral culpability? Chen interviewed religious leaders, philosophers, and ethicists. Father Michael Torres from the local Catholic Church believed Mason had chosen evil despite whatever biological predisposition existed. Free will meant responsibility. Rabbi Sarah Goldstein argued that someone incapable of empathy couldn't truly choose in a moral sense. Philosopher Dr. James Wright suggested the question was irrelevant. Regardless of cause, society had to protect itself from people like Mason. The why mattered for prevention, but not for punishment. The most disturbing part of the documentary was Mason's complete lack of change. Chen interviewed him 3 separate times over 18 months. Mason's answers became more refined, more polished. He had learned what reactions people expected. He could discuss the murders with rehearsed remorse. But Chen, watching the footage repeatedly, could see the performance. The empathy was simulated. The regret was intellectual rather than emotional. In unguarded moments, when Mason thought the camera wasn't focused on him, his face returned to that blank neutrality. The mask was getting better, but underneath was still nothing. Dr. Martinez, the prison psychologist, told Chen that Mason represented her greatest professional failure. She had spent 3 years trying to reach him, and she had made 0 progress. He knows what he should feel, he just doesn't feel it. The documentary ended with the unanswerable question that haunted everyone connected to the case. What do we do with someone like Mason Carter? Keep him locked up forever? That was the current solution. But he had been 14 when sentenced. He might live another 60 or 70 years in prison. The cost would run into millions of dollars. And for what purpose? He couldn't be rehabilitated. He showed no signs of remorse or change. He wasn't suffering in any meaningful way. He had adapted to prison like he adapted to everything, with cold efficiency and complete emotional detachment. Was lifetime imprisonment justice or just expensive warehousing? And if not that, then what? Society had no better answer. Chen's final interview was with Michael Henderson. 3 years had passed since his sister's murder. Michael had aged visibly. His hair had gone gray. Lines creased his face that hadn't been there before. Chen asked if Michael had found any peace. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. There's no peace when someone you love is violently taken. No closure when you know their killer feels nothing. Mason Carter stole my sister, my niece, my brother-in-law. He stole my parents' final years. He stole a piece of every person who knew them, and he doesn't care. That's what keeps me awake at night. Not just that they're gone, but that the person who did it is completely empty where a soul should be. How do you accept that? How do you move forward knowing evil like that exists and wears the face of a child? 5 years had passed since that Thursday night in March. Mason Carter was now 19 years old, marking his 5th year behind bars. The prison had become his entire world. The same concrete walls, the same rigid schedule, the same faces in the yard. Most inmates struggled with the monotony, the claustrophobia of knowing this was forever. But Mason existed in prison the way he had existed everywhere else, with complete detachment and perfect adaptation. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, his face harder. The 14-year-old boy was physically gone, but the emptiness inside remained unchanged. Officers who watched him noted that he never complained, never fought, never caused trouble. He was the perfect prisoner, and that terrified them more than the violent ones. Linda Carter had aged far more than 5 years. She was 43 but looked 60. The guilt had consumed her from the inside out. She had lost both jobs after Mason's conviction. Nobody wanted to employ the mother of a child killer. She lived on disability now, diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety. She still visited Mason once a month, sitting across from him in that sterile visiting room, searching desperately for some sign of the child she had loved. But that child had never existed. She finally accepted that truth in year 4. The realization didn't bring peace. It brought a different kind of grief. She was mourning someone who had never been real. A phantom son she had invented to cover the reality of the stranger she had raised. The Henderson family had learned to carry their grief rather than overcome it. Michael had started a foundation in his sister's name. The Sarah Henderson Memorial Fund provided scholarships to nursing students who demonstrated exceptional compassion. Emma's name lived on through the animal shelter programs. David was remembered every day by former students who had become engineers and scientists and teachers themselves, inspired by his dedication. The family's legacy was love and service. Mason's legacy was destruction. That imbalance felt like a small justice. The people Mason had tried to erase were remembered and celebrated. His name would eventually be forgotten, just another case file in a database of violent criminals. The victims would outlive their killer in memory and impact. Mason's appeals had all been denied. His lawyers argued that sentencing a 14-year-old to life without parole constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The appellate courts disagreed. The premeditation, the violence, the psychological evaluations, and Mason's own statements justified the sentence. The Supreme Court had ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. But Mason's sentence wasn't mandatory. Judge Rhodes had considered his age and circumstances before deciding. The appellate judges upheld her decision unanimously. Mason would die in prison. That was certain now. No legal avenue remained. He received the news without visible reaction. He had expected it, even hoped for it in a strange way. Appeals created uncertainty. Mason preferred certainty. Now he knew exactly what his future held. Dr. Martinez continued her monthly evaluations, documenting Mason's complete lack of progress. Other juvenile lifers in the system showed growth over years. They developed insight, expressed genuine remorse. Some even transformed into advocates for victims' rights, using their own stories to prevent violence. But Mason remained frozen. He participated in required programs, took college courses through the Prison Education Initiative. He was even working toward a degree in psychology, which struck Dr. Martinez as deeply unsettling. Mason studying human behavior was like a shark studying swimming patterns, pure predatory interest. In one session, Dr. Martinez asked why he chose that field. "To understand what people think I'm missing," Mason said. "Maybe if I understand it intellectually, I can replicate it convincingly enough that you'll all stop watching me so closely." The honesty was chilling. Mason had stopped pretending with Dr. Martinez. He knew she saw through his performances anyway. So he treated their sessions as intellectual exercises. He was curious about his own psychology, not troubled by it. He wanted to understand himself the way a scientist studies a specimen. Dr. Martinez asked if he ever thought about the Henderson family. "Sometimes," Mason admitted. "Mostly I wonder what Emma would have become. The veterinarian thing. She was passionate about it. It would have been interesting to see if she maintained that passion into adulthood." Dr. Martinez felt nauseous. Mason spoke about the girl he murdered with the same detached curiosity one might discuss a canceled television show. Mild interest in an incomplete narrative. Nothing more. On the 5th anniversary of the murders, A small memorial service was held in Riverside. The community had shrunk slightly, families moving away seeking fresh starts in places without such painful memories. But many remained. They gathered at the park where a permanent memorial had been erected. 3 bronze plaques with the Henderson family's names, dates, and a quote that Sarah had often said, "Kindness is strength." The mayor spoke briefly. Michael Henderson thanked the community for their continued support. Emma's former classmates, now 17 years old, released white balloons into the March sky. It was a gentle, peaceful tribute to lives that had ended in violence. The contrast was intentional. Mason had brought horror. The community responded with love. Linda attended from a distance, standing behind a tree where no one would see her. She wasn't welcome at these events. Her presence would cause pain to people who were trying to heal. But she needed to witness it, needed to see how the town remembered them. When the balloons rose into the sky, Linda wept. For the family her son destroyed. For the mother she had failed to be. For the life she would now live in the shadow of Mason's evil. After the service ended and everyone left, Linda approached the memorial. She placed 3 white roses at its base. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The words felt meaningless, but she had nothing else to offer except a lifetime of sorrow and a promise to never forget what her son had taken from the world. Mason spent the anniversary of his crimes like any other day. Morning work detail in the prison laundry, lunch in the cafeteria, afternoon education classes, recreation hour in the yard, dinner, lockdown. He didn't mark the date, didn't think about it more than usual. The murders existed in his mind as a completed task, an achievement even, in its own twisted way. He had proven he could plan and execute a complex crime. The capture was unfortunate but didn't diminish the accomplishment in his view. When another inmate asked if he regretted anything, Mason thought carefully before answering. "I regret the fingerprint," he said. "Should have worn better gloves." The inmate stared at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. "You're talking about triple murder, man." Mason shrugged. "I'm talking about a mistake that cost me my freedom." The inmate walked away quickly. Even hardened criminals found Mason disturbing. The sun set on the 5th anniversary the same way it had set on the night of the murders. The same indifferent sky, the same turning of the earth. Time moved forward whether anyone wanted it to or not. The Henderson family remained dead. Mason remained imprisoned. Linda remained broken. The community remained scarred. There was no redemption in this story, no transformation, no healing that made the tragedy worthwhile. Sometimes evil simply exists. It takes what it wants. It destroys what it touches. And it offers no lessons except the bitter knowledge that such emptiness can wear a human face and walk among us undetected until it's too late. The gavel had fallen 5 years ago. Justice had been served in the only way the law allowed. But justice couldn't resurrect the dead, or restore innocence, or answer the fundamental question of why. It could only ensure that Mason Carter would never hurt anyone again. The boy who murdered 3 people would spend 60 or 70 more years in prison. He would grow old there. Gray hair and wrinkled skin, the same blank eyes, the same empty core. Eventually he would die, probably from some illness common to elderly inmates. His death would be recorded, his body processed, and the world would continue without him, just as it had continued without the Hendersons. Except the Hendersons had left beauty behind them, students they inspired, patients they saved, animals they cared for, love they shared. Their absence created a void because their presence had mattered. Mason's eventual death would create nothing, because his life, despite continuing for decades, had ended the night he chose murder. He had become a ghost that day, a hollow shell going through motions in a concrete cage. And perhaps that was the real justice. Not that he suffered, but that he simply ceased to matter. The victims would be remembered, the killer would be forgotten, and in that imbalance there was something close to peace.